Hello, good evening, everyone. I think we are ready to start this evening's session. It's great to have you all here. We are 111 tonight. This is a session organized by STARTS Ecosystem. My name is Ramona, and I work for the organization Gluon in Brussels, Belgium. And together with my colleagues of STARTS Ecosystem, we organize these monthly gatherings. Camille is waving, and Anafel is somewhere here as well. We organize monthly sessions on highlighting the impact of STARTS in different sectors or domains. And this session especially is the last session dedicated towards the collaboration toolkits, which we launched in July 2020. And we are very happy to have here tonight Claudia. A short introduction on Claudia. I'm sure many of you know Claudia already, but for those who don't, Claudia is a curator and a producer of art and science collaborations. She's also a researcher in the intersection of arts and science and has been working more or investigating more than 10 years art-science collaborations. She's a social and economical scientist, and she has additional backgrounds in cultural sciences, and her recent work really focused on the intersection of arts with new technologies and scientific research. And she has explored the impacts of artistic intervention and has extensive experience in collaborating but also advising institutions to develop artist in residency programs. And more recently, Claudia also published a book in which she highlights how art-science collaboration leads to heightened innovation and value for organizations. But the book also creates a blueprint for successful collaborations and partnerships and provides a lot of insights into the managerial parts when creating art and science programs. But I suggest that we give the floor to Claudia. Afterwards, there will be plenty of time for questions and discussion, and the talk will take approximately half an hour. So Claudia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the nice introduction. I start sharing my screen. Let's see. So you should see my screen. As was highlighted right now by Ramona, is that this session is still connected to the STARTS toolkit. So I decided to talk a little bit about the background and thoughts about approaches to value added of art science projects and how to connect this to something more also theoretically founded, but also connected to examples and case studies. So I'll start by introducing a little bit myself. So whom you see here, that's me, but don't be deceived by this laughing face. I'll talk a lot about theory today and some of the work that I've done. As Ramona just said, I've got a big background in social and economic sciences. So this is the bunch of theory that also frames the conversation and the talk I'm giving now, and how I try to relate the value added and the evaluation process of art science projects and or art science tech projects to theory and to something substantial that can be understood by many different stakeholders. But now first I want to start with some anecdotal evidence and examples that we all know are super interesting and super important that we all have and inspire us all. So for example, this one example is the collaboration between Anouk Wipprecht and CITAC, a company in Austria, but actually also active worldwide, developing EEG sensors. And for another EU project, Sparks, Anouk developed the Agent Unicorn project. And in this project, she started to work with GTAC. And from this first project in 2016, a lot of different scientific interest, technological interest developed, but also a lot of work with GTAC on their outreach projects, new hackathons, new ideas for products, even the idea of having a product for makers and designers and not only for scientists developed. And then last year, a second collaborative project, the pangolin dress, was presented at Ars Electronica, and it had a lot of interesting feedback in scientific journals, in tech journals, but also in blogs and more common outreach. And then there are other examples that are super interesting and that we all like to reproduce. And for example, looking on the one side, it's inspired by Robertina Szebiani's Aquatocene, just a recently published research article where scientists from Taiwan approached Robertina because they were inspired by her work. And they wanted to use her work and work with her. And also inspired by this work, they published a scientific article. And then there are other opportunities that we also all know, that scientists are brought into collaborations with artists, but they don't know how to deal with it. And it's important for either the facilitator or the curator to make the scientists understand why they should collaborate with this artist. And sometimes it just clicks, just as it did with this project Robertina had, but also she connected to other scientists in more formal collaboration where the scientists gradually got interested and inspired by her work. And the other one is an ongoing residency that we hopefully launch soon as a real residency on site at the Helmholtz Center in Munich, the Institute for Epigenetics and stem cell research with Anna Dumitriu, where she already is in discussion with the scientists and inspired some interesting experiments they want to do, and also of course thinks about how to reach out to the public and start a conversation with the public. So these are all examples that have very different added value and very different ideas that we all want to replicate, but it's difficult to replicate. And so we try, and often in the conversation about why do we do and why we want to do art science collaborations or art science tech projects, we try to jump from what we see in this anecdotal evidence to say, okay, this is innovation, this is creativity, or more formally in more tech context, we want to humanize technology, or it's about digital humanism, we need to bring more the human aspects to technology, or we want to reach the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But is this really what outside tech does and is inherent in outside tech, or how is it connected, is the important question to answer to make it really interesting for scientists, for corporations, but also for artists to investigate their time and their attention and all their energy into these collaborations, because these collaborations are intensive. So what is this, how to create a solid why we should engage that links what we saw in these examples, that links this anecdotal evidence in the cases that we see to these big goals that we want to reach. And maybe also these big goals are an opportunity to align the goals between the artists, the corporations, and the scientists. But this is actually one aspect. The more important aspect is really how to link what we experience to what we want to do and to what we can do in these collaborations. So the question is really how to formalize this added value, how to relate it to the different goals and needs for the participating parties and the needs of defined by what is that they want to reach in their work, but also what it is they need to reach the goals like innovation, creativity, or humanized technology. And what can we provide when we talk about added value as a realistic added value? What can we say, oh, is it realistic that we all have this really interesting outcome at the end of every collaboration process? Or are there other implications of art science collaboration processes that we see far, far beyond the actual residency and are not really part of the outcome of the immediate thing that we see in the artwork or in the scientific work, but have implications long term? And then there is one last very important thing that I see as from my scientific background as super important. What do we know actually about all these things, about creativity, about innovation, about organizational processes, but also personal processes, and how do we connect this to the art science process and to what we want to reach? Because as a very famous, or at least in this kind of research, famous title of a paper is "Bring the Arts and Get the Creativity for Free." Is it really that when we bring the arts into an organization or into a scientific environment that there's immediately creativity everywhere? Because is it really something like contagious like a virus, or is it something that emerges from a process and from interaction? So as I just mentioned, there is this research about artistic interventions in organizations, which already has explored these phenomena and what we experience when we engage with art in other contexts, not only tech and science organizations, but other organizational contexts. And it shows that there are different levels of what we can understand of the impact and the value added of art science or artistic interventions in these organizations, which can be referred to different levels of the organization, like the individual, the team level, or the organizational level at all, or even the connection from the organization to its environment, or also how to influence the environment. But it also already shows a little bit how to connect all these different impacts that we identify in the examples and in these anecdotal evidence back to, for example, research theory, which I will show in a minute. So I want to show this a little more with an example, because I think it's easier to understand here. This is one project. I was lucky to talk to the audience and to the curators and to the scientists who participated in this. It's the project STARTSEU within the P9 Autodesk residency project or program, which is not existing anymore, which is also something that shows us how important it is to talk about the added value in different languages that the participating parties can understand. So here in this project, 3 artists from France came to San Francisco, P9, working with the scientific department on this robotic tattooing arm. So they had this idea, they had this vision to create a tattooing machine with such a big industrial robot. At the same time, the scientific future group, the far future-looking group at Autodesk, had the idea that they needed to do something to make people understand that in future creatives and other people need to work more closely with these robots. But they could not really realize such an interesting or such a far-fetched project like a tattooing machine made of such an industrial robot arm. So it needed the residency that triggered the process that they could realize such a project together. And in the end, you could think, oh yeah, it's nice, and it's a nice implication that we need to work closer with the robots in future. Yeah, probably everybody could have guessed. But the most important thing is that it also triggered something in the organization, and it triggered something in the organization that led to a new development in the safety department, and also the exploration of new interests in the safety department. So it needs the different levels of communication and identification of the value added on the organizational level, on the scientific level, and on the artistic level that we can realize, and that we also can speak about successful projects so that they make sense for everybody who contributed, unless we say, okay, the artist is something like a consultant. Another super successful example, of course, is experiments in arts and technology. And they also understand to create a program that is interesting for the scientists and for the artists, so that they have the place to explore, that they have a common goal. So it's about humanizing technology, it's about the emotional and human factor of technology in future, the technology we're going to use. And it also communicates the value of this process and of the whole program to the organization and an organizational level. So here again, just summing it up a bit. So it's important to break down who are the participating parties that we are talking to. Is it industry? Is it scientific organizations? Is it a cultural organization? Why would they engage, and why are they interested actually? Also, what do the individuals want? The artists, the scientists, the engineers, and what also the managers, how do they understand? How do curators work with them? And what is the bigger picture? Also, what is the implication that we want? Is it to humanize technology? Why do we want this? Why do we want this innovation? Why do we think we need to be creative or work interdisciplinary? And it's also, again, I want to go back to also a little bit more social science research. The question, what do all these actors need to be creative? So how can this be linked with the creativity theory, for example, to understand why art science, outside tech projects in organizations, whatever organization it is, make sense? So a little more repetition actually. So where's the contribution to the scientific and organizational goals? What are the theoretical aspects? But also, how does it develop to me individually? In terms of how do I understand or change my thinking? How do I get more creative, or do we get more creative in the organization? What are the desired goals and what are the expectations? And then one last question, what makes bringing arts in the mix so special? When we talk about all these ideas, we often have the science, the tech, or whatever environment in mind. But what makes it so special to bring in the arts? And what makes it special for the arts to be brought in? Here, I'm going a little back to the creativity theory that I announced earlier. And here you can already see a little bit linking back to the first what we saw in the artistic interventions research, that there is an individual level, that there is a group level, that there is an organizational level, that there is a process level or behavior level, and the situation that we frame. So creativity research, it's especially in this field, it's going on for over 40 years, and thinking of flow from Csikszentmihalyi in 1975, going to all these different stages, especially to understand what makes a group or an organization creative and innovative. In the 1990s, there was a lot of research, but it's still going on, shows that there are different aspects that we need on all these different levels to make us more creative and to also contribute to relevant innovation. So we already see that when we go back to this slide, that we have a lot in common here. We have implications on the individual level, on the setting, on the organizational level. We have some of these implications named already here, that we can see that artistic interventions can do in organizations. So it's interesting to think, how can we link what we can experience in all these examples of art science collaboration to creativity processes, for example. And here again, when we talk about art science and not only interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity, what is so special about art and what is so special about aesthetics that it's such an important contribution? And we already know a lot. So for example, critical reflection is an important part that always comes up first, and also the, of course, creative character. But actually there are even more deeper questions also here from the organizational, but also from the cultural and art theory perspective. So what does it actually do when we encounter art or aesthetics? How does this influence our own critical thinking and our abilities, or how does it help us to get in touch with what we already know? And then in the next step, what does getting engaged in this art science collaboration do? And maybe also what does it do with us to get engaged in or to connect to a creative process of an artist? And then again, there is a lot of research around that, about skill development, about how arts-based interventions in STEM education, for example, help different STEM professionals to refine their own skills, or to also see new things, or to help them in pattern recognition. And then there's the last level: how does this affect the organizational process, and how can we also, when we bring in the arts, interrupt or disrupt? And how can we align this idea of it's a long-term evolution, actually, what we as individuals learn, how we build also the interdisciplinary or team skills, and what we experience in specific interactions with artists, that it has maybe a really impactful outcome. So it's not an immediately measurable outcome often, but some impact that comes maybe even 3 years after. As I had this one word on the other slide, organizational aesthetics, this is something I don't want you to think of organizational aesthetics just as purely research into how we design our organizations. Actually, it's going into a different direction. It is thinking about how do we design, or how do we experience our work processes? How do we have or gain routines? How do we work with the skills, even craft skills that we have? And how can we make this intangible knowledge, again, more tangible by disrupting or interrupting what we automatically know through our senses when we work? So here, there's a lot that we can work with. For example, when we do some art science collaboration work, or when we do some artistic interventions. So trying to, I don't know, I'm sorry, it's all super complex and a lot of theory. So there's social science and creativity theory, and then there's a lot, there are all these questions about aesthetics and arts and what it does with us when we work with art. And then there are all these anecdotal examples. So I try to bring this a little bit together in the aforementioned book that is asking about how what we see in art science collaboration processes can be translated a little more digestible language into effects that are related to creative processes and to innovation in organizational settings and in different settings, and how can we relate this how can this be interesting for artists, for scientists, and for organizations? And I tried to use a set of theories that were already implied in the artistic intervention research, that there is some kind of effect. And I won't go through all of these theories, but for example, there is something we can talk about, how art science collaborations also contributes to the skill of interdisciplinary collaboration. Because we really have to start at the beginning. This is nothing that we can take for granted. Interdisciplinary collaboration is a skill and something that we need to learn to engage with and to understand how we can approach each other. It's also actually linked to one of the last points on the slide here, and that's communication. How do we communicate across borders? How do we communicate across disciplinary borders? But then also working on other topics like meaningful work theory. How can we, when we engage with art, see the meaning in our work again? Or how does this motivate us in our work process? And when we go back to creativity theory, there is actually a lot that connects all these aspects with important factors that feed into our creative process and in our potential creativity creative output. Yeah, so before I take too much time here, I'll go to 3 very quick examples that illustrate some of these cases here. The first one is Sarah Kraski's Theriac. It came out of her Synpeptide art residency at the Bioprocess Laboratory in Zurich, and it's an antibiotic, and it was developed in one of her collaborations with 2 team members there. And in this collaboration process, they had a lot of interesting experiences, because Sarah had a completely different process in her work. So she started to contextualize a lot of the work that happened in this laboratory with work that happened previously and in the region and also in the local museum. And suddenly new projects could emerge and new ideas came up of how to approach the next level of the peptide that they were developing. And she also asked or did some experiments in a specific facility that the scientists thought, oh, that's something that we know from literature that doesn't work, and it worked. So they were super interested in why it worked the way it worked. So they had a lot of new, interesting input for their work and could contextualize and communicate with the local and also with broader audience. Another project, this is more about communication. Although this project was built for communicating to somebody else, for a public engagement project, it actually was reported by the scientists that it was super important for them to understand how to talk to the artist, and these conversations with the artists helped them in other interdisciplinary collaborations so that they could use the right language to translate their specific scientific jargon to the other scientists that they were collaborating with. And the last one, one of my favorites, is about sense-making processes and aesthetics. So sense-making is about how do we sense, or how do we make sense of the world around us? How do we understand patterns? How do we understand what we should do implicitly in specific situations? And the more we are trained in something, the more we have specific sense-making processes, for example, of how we should perceive the data or how we should work with it. And it's a lot about, not only about rational processing, but also about sensory triggers. So how do we see, how do we hear, and so on. And a cosmologist was working on his PhD study, and he really did not get his head around something that looked very, very strange to him, but he didn't know how and why and how to translate it to something that makes sense in his study. And only after when he's discussing this with his e-guitar teacher, he started to understand the waves in a different way, and through playing music and discussing and hearing, he started to reformulate what he saw in his or heard in his data, and started to make progress in his work. So we talked now a lot about how this can all contribute to our creative process and also to our work process. And I'm totally aware that this is a lot directed to scientists and how we can motivate scientists to get engaged in our science projects. But we should never forget to understand and to reflect what is the art's interest in engaging in our science projects, because this also heightens the level of the engagement when we really know that when the artists are really into this collaboration process and are acknowledged on eye height and can contribute to the discussion and are not just treated as the consultant or as somebody who is on a different level or who is just contributing to our goal at the end, because there are common goals, as we saw in the beginning. Yes, there's just a few more things that I wanted to add, and then when we go through all this knowledge that we developed, this actually helps us not only to frame our conversation and with the people we want to work with and with the organizations we want to work with, but also it also helps us to frame the practices in the different organizations, for example, and to understand what we need to do in the different organizations or situations in order to reach our goals. So to understand, for example, the impact of the process or the value of the outcome, it's a lot matter of perspective, language, and expectations, and how we frame and discuss it. And also always to point to the critical factors of time, openness, and space, because all of this can't be just done as a fun project in after hours. It's something that we really engage in, and that helps us to carve out the space to become more creative in our work. And here I just want to add one more small project or one program that I find is super interesting in terms of framing, because it has a lot of impact in the organization, also in the organizational in the creative process of the scientists. The Plant Labs residency that was led by first Stearns, and it was not even always a collaborative art science program, but just bringing the arts to this amazing organization. Sometimes there was a collaboration, sometimes it was just art production, and still there were a lot of claims about how it contributed to organizational culture, to employee retention, to openness and creative processes, just because it showed that the organization is really open to new ideas, is really inclusive and diverse. So it can already be impactful to engage with art and to create a new organizational culture, or a new culture, a new interdisciplinary culture where everybody can contribute. So yeah, actually then when we can start to discuss like in depth and not just draw on buzzwords, we really can go and think about how we can contribute to all these different high aims and goals that we have. Here's just, for a snapshot, some of the references that I've been drawing from in the last 30 minutes or so. Thank you, and feel free to drop me an email whenever you have any question or are interested in something specific.
Well, thanks a lot, Claudia, for sharing your expertise and insights with us tonight. We